Hey guys, Mr. P.
Hey, and it's Mr. Schmitz.
In this video, we're going to talk about the specific limits to growth. In the last video, we talked about how population growth occurs and what contributes to population growth.
We also looked at how ecologists quantify population growth and the ways that we can measure and evaluate population change with species.
So what are some of the limiting factors that control population growth? Each of these pictures in some capacity will influence a population. And when you look at them just side by side, it appears that they're all just kind of randomly thrown together, but there are some ways that we can sort this group.
Absolutely. So if we start in the top left up here, you can see that we've got a couple of, it looks like antelope, maybe? What are those?
Nyala?
Nyala?
I don't know. Gemsbach? Kudu? Something.
We got a couple of
African ungulates. And while we're talking about ungulates, are hoofed animals. Those are grazers of some kind, but that is obviously showing a bit of competition between the two. They may be competing for mates or competing for the lush savanna grasses that they obviously are standing by.
It's a good thing that we don't have to resort to those types of combat.
Right. The lunchroom can get pretty vicious sometimes.
Quite nasty. If you continue, you can see a textbook example of a predator and prey relationship. Obviously, predators are going to help to limit prey populations. There are many examples of this in nature, the cheetah and the gazelle being shown here. I love this picture. You can see the cheetah's tail working as a counterbalance, helping it reach its maximum speeds of around 70 miles an hour. It's a pretty incredible adaptation.
Right, and one that we obviously don't have.
Correct.
Because no tail. I will say that while we're talking about competition and predation for that matter, did you know that there are a lot of ecosystems in which multiple predators will compete for the same prey items?
I believe we've seen that in a lot of our food webs.
That's true. Next, we have an example of parasitism/disease, and the reason these are combined is that a lot of times parasites will carry disease or be vectors for disease. In this case, a mosquito obviously can be an animal that can carry Zika virus and some other types of diseases like malaria. And while we're talking about parasitism, I just learned a fun fact that there is an animal on the planet that is actually pretty rare, the Tasmanian devil. I don't know that it's quite endangered.
Well, I know there's definitely one in Looney Tunes.
Right. I did not. Right you are. While we're talking about the Tasmanian devil, the real one, in Australia, there is actually a contagious facial tumor disease, DFTD, which was responsible for reducing about 70% of their population over a really short amount of time. So that definitely illustrates an example of how parasitism and disease can drastically control populations over time.
Yeah, that's incredibly impactful. Up next is herbivory. Herbivory is the preying on of producers by what we would call herbivores. You guys remember that vocab word from your last unit. One famous, notorious herbivore would be the locusts, which aren't always super common, but every so often, every few years, we have a massive locust outbreak, and they are notorious for their swarming behavior, which can devastate plant life due to the large amounts of plants that they can consume in a very short amount of time. It can be very dangerous for our crops, but also forests and our grassland ecosystems as well.
And I don't know that I've ever experienced an actual quote-unquote swarm, but I have seen groups of them that get quite large.
Yes.
So we're kind of shifting at this point. We had 4 examples that obviously have animals or organisms in them, and now we kind of shift into just a puddle of water on dry, baked ground. And so droughts are incredibly impactful in controlling population, obviously because water is required for life, and organisms need water on a daily basis. And some organisms need large amounts of water, like some of your big mammals, elephants, rhinos, I know require gallons of water a day. And so if you limit water and limit the availability of water, you're obviously going to control populations. Weather has a big impact over population growth as well. Obviously, really severe weather systems, hurricanes, tsunamis, tornadoes have a big impact on their particular ecosystems.
Absolutely. We know all about tornadoes here in Kansas. We live in Tornado Alley. Last, actually, I saw statistics. Kansas was leading the global number of tornadoes this year in 2024. So,
whoa.
Fun fact for you there.
Wow. Didn't know that.
Yeah. I don't know if to date that is still current, but at the end of the summer, that was at least the statistics that I saw.
Next is overcrowding. Obviously is another animal example, and that has to do, like we talked about in the last video, with increased population density comes overcrowding. And with overcrowding and population density increases, that breeds competition, and it breeds disease. It's lack of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think back to last lecture, we talked about those growth curves. As a population experiences a period of exponential growth, as they grow too quickly, you will see overcrowding and the spread of, like you just mentioned, disease and those things really start to impact a population as that population hits its maximum carrying capacity.
Next is another weather pattern. Hurricanes are obviously linked more closely to oceans and coastal environments. And obviously there are some organisms that live in these coastal situations or the coastal islands. One specifically, the iguana. Often if you were to look at population curves or population densities, a lot of times their population crashes after hurricanes. Hurricanes can be devastating to a coastal environment.
Last on here we have wildfires. Wildfires have been fairly common in recent years, at least making the news. We've had some very, very large wildfires, which are incredibly devastating to a forest ecosystem, as it takes quite a length of time for trees to regrow. This would be separate from some of the fires that you see here in Kansas in the springtime. So we intentionally burn our fields, call that a prescribed burn. We do that and as a way to regenerate nutrients in our soil, and we'll talk about that more later in this unit. But these wildfires are incredibly devastating and can cause dramatic shifts in the ecosystem when they occur.
And I remember, 8 years ago, Australia had a really bad wildfire outbreak.
Man, has that already been 8 years?
I don't know. Don't fact check me. But I do know that it has been some time. I think it was pre-COVID.
It was pre-COVID, yes. It was. I think it might have actually been the year that COVID really hit, because at the same time that COVID was hitting, basically half of Australia was on fire.
Right.
So it's an incredibly impactful factor for population growth.
So when we look at all of these individually, they obviously impact population growth and population numbers, but we need to begin to kind of divide them out into different groups. And so if you see on the left side, we have what we call density dependent factors, and on the right, we have density independent factors.
So if you take a look on the left first, these are the same factors we just talked about, but these would be considered density dependent. These are the ones that are operating and impacting based on the number of individuals in the population. So these effects are higher or worse when there are more individuals in the population. So that would be things like the spread of disease and competition and herbivory and overcrowding and predator-prey interactions. All of those are impacted to a higher degree when populations are higher.
So you would say they are directly correlated to population density?
Absolutely, yes.
So as density increases, so does
the effect of this factor, whatever that factor is that you're looking at.
Yeah. Density dependent factors are directly dependent on the number of organisms in an environment. If we contrast that with the other side of the screen, which is the right side, these are density independent factors. It means these factors are not influenced by the number of organisms in the environment. So you could have a drought in a really highly populated area, or you can have a drought in a really sparsely populated area. Weather patterns, tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires, high rains, no rain, all of that can happen regardless of whether there's animals in that area or not. Both of these sides, both density independent and dependent, can have drastic effects on populations. So we're not talking about one being more significant than the other. They both influence populations tremendously. However, density independent means completely independent of population size. Density dependent is directly dependent on population size.
And I think before we move on, it is important to note that the density dependent factors, which are the ones on the left again, are the ones that determine a carrying capacity for a population. Whereas your density independent factors like weather and massive natural disasters don't specifically determine a carrying capacity, but will force massive population change from which a population has to then recover. So that carrying capacity from last lecture that Mr. Pfeiffer so eloquently illustrated just now is determined by our density-dependent factors like competition, predation, spread of disease. We're going to finish up this lecture by talking about one specific example of population dynamics. This is a sort of ongoing case study. Scientists identified this interaction that was happening on a place called Isle Royale, which is off the coast of Lake Superior, kind of up in the northern United States, and that's looking at some wolves and moose populations. And so what we're going to kind of talk through is the interactions that have caused the change in the population of both of these organisms, as well as some of the other factors that have impacted their population. So to start with, how did these moose and wolves get onto an island? It's a fairly small island in the middle of a lake. They were able to get there through a change in the weather. Basically, the lake got cold enough over the course of a couple of winters that allowed for what we would call a land bridge. Actually, it's technically ice, but so an ice bridge. The lake solidified enough that both moose, probably moose first, going over looking for plants to eat, made it over to the island, and then some wolves followed as a predatory reaction. And so what you see first is this beginning population. And if we look at just the graph here, it is important to note that we're starting obviously in the early or mid 1950s. And you have a couple of axes here. So at the bottom, we're tracking years. And then you have sort of a double axis where we have the number of moose, and that's shown from 0 to a couple thousand, so 2,400 moose. And then on the other side of the axis, you have number of wolves, and that is on a different scale, but we're still able to overlay them. So understand when looking at this that we're not saying that there are more wolves than there are moose. It is on a different scale, but you can still see the impact that these two have had on each other. So let's kind of work through this and take a look at how these two have impacted each other.
And it is a really cool case study, and one that is really famous to show population dynamics. And the first area we're going to focus on is this area in here, and we're going to lay this particular topic down, which is predation. We just talked about how this is a case study that shows predator-prey relationships. Here you can see that wolves in blue are at kind of a low point in their population size, and as they remain low, the number of moose are increasing. However, that when the moose population increases, so does right afterwards the number of wolves, and that is just due to a predatory response, and when more prey is available, more predators can be supported.
Eventually what you see, however, is the wolf population reaches a point that it's very high. And remember that density dependent factor we just talked about, disease. So this is CPV, which is a disease that impacts wolves. We see that there were so many wolves, they probably went above their carrying capacity here, which we would call an overshoot. So there was some overcrowding that occurred, which meant the disease spread really easy. Think back to COVID when we had to sit 6 feet apart, right? That's to spread ourselves out to decrease the spread of disease. So we have this disease spread, and that causes a massive downshoot in the wolf population, all the way down to, I think, 11 wolves.
Wow, which is quite a bit lower than they were originally at 50 wolves.
Continuing on, when that decrease happens, what does that allow to occur for your moose population? Well, there's very few predators, so now your moose population can increase fairly dramatically. So if you track that, that's a pretty quick turnaround of the moose population.
Right, because it goes from around 800 meese to about 20.
I'm not sure meese is correct.
I don't know. It sounded good. 800 moosei. 800 moosei to 800 meese to around 2,400 meese.
And then what happens at 2,400 meese is we have sort of obviously an increase in competition. This was actually combined with sort of a twofold factor here. This was a really intense couple of years in a row with really, really cold winters, which meant that the plants were not growing as much and a lot more plants were dying. So we're highlighting the weather event that occurred. So combined with the fact that our moose population has reached an all-time high and the weather is less favorable for growing plants, we now have this massive increase in what we would call herbivory, which is their competition for their food source. You see a massive decline then in the moose population.
And because the wolf population was increasing simultaneously with this moose population decline, you will see right after the wolf population increase that they would follow with a decline as well. So if you look at kind of the overall takeaways from this population study, there are density independent and density dependent factors. The density dependent factors are the ones we have in green, and the density independent factors would be the ones in orange. But when you look at trends over time, when a prey item increases, so does a predator population. When a predator population declines, the prey item or prey population will increase as well, and so they typically follow the same trends relatively closely over the course of several years.
Right, there generally is typically a small lag in the change of population from one to the next, but they are absolutely sort of chasing each other through this graph.
That's it for this lecture. If you learned something, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you.
Thanks, guys.